Hi everyone. First of all, welcome to 1984, New Authoritarianism and the Media, an event organised by the OU's Political and International Studies discipline, part of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. My name's Donna Smith and I'm a politics academic at the OU with a particular interest in politics and media, and I'm the chair for this evening. It's great to see so many people in attendance. At the last count we had over 600 people registered, which is fantastic. So many people in fact that in a slight change to our plans, while we're all in teams, we've asked all of you to watch in stadium. This means we have enough capacity, can also moderate the event easily tonight. So hello to everyone watching in stadium. So a little bit of housekeeping before moving on to the event proper. In the second half of the session, there's a chance for you to all ask questions. Please send in your questions via the link on Stadium. They'll come through to me and I'll select some of them to ask the speakers tonight. We also want to encourage discussion amongst you as we go along. So if you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag OU1984 to chat about the issues raised tonight. This event is being recorded and will be available online later and potentially as part of our module materials, but we're being recorded, not you, so you're okay. So on to the subject matter itself. As you'll probably know, 2019 was the 70th anniversary of the publication of George Orwell's 1984. And this event aims to both celebrate this anniversary while also considering the legacies and future of authoritarianism. If we define authoritarianism as a form of government characterised by strong central power and limited political freedoms, the notion of 1984 being a novel about authoritarianism is pretty clear. We have Big Brother, the personification of the unseen leader of the Party of Oceania, the control language of newspeak, the notion of doublethink, which is the act of simultaneously accepting two mutually contradictory beliefs as correct, and the threat of becoming an unperson, someone whose existence has been excised from public and private memory. It's often said that we're living in an authoritarian state. Think, for instance, of the propaganda of Trump, the way in which language is utilised, and some would say lies embedded. Similar accusations are made about things like the Leave Brexit campaign, and also maybe the current government's response to coronavirus as well. But also on the left, we have to consider the ways in which diversion from so-called progressive opinion can lead to social and political banishment, as well as the way that leftist social media has utilised language, imagery, and some would say doublethink to progress a point of view. That said, we could say the metaphor is an exaggerated one. As I think Dorian Lynskey's noted, by definition, a country in which you are free to read 1984 is not the country described in 1984. So to discuss this novel, modern parallels, 21st century authoritarianism and the impact of the media, and what this means for democracy, I'd like to welcome our speakers today. First of all, we have Dorian Lynskey, author of the acclaimed The Ministry of Truth, the biography of George Orwell's 1984. Dorian's also the author of 33 Revolutions per Minute, a history of protest songs, and his journalism's appeared in titles including The Guardian and The Observer. Also, D.J Taylor, author of Orwell the Life, which won the Whitbread Biography Prize in 2003. Also, two novels longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and his latest book on Orwell on 1984 was published last year. Also, OU politics academics Precious Chatterje-Doody and Geoff Andrews. Precious is a lecturer in Polis whose work focuses on the links between communication, perception and politics. And her book on Russia Today and conspiracy theories, People, Power and Politics, is due to be published next year. And finally, Geoff Andrews, a historian based at the OU's politics department. He's written widely on the history of British communism, Italian politics and the Cambridge Spies, and his latest book, published this year, is Agent Moliere, The Life of John Cairncross, the fifth man of the Cambridge spy cycle. So I think we can agree a fantastic lineup. So in terms of how things will work this evening, I'll first hand over to Geoff, who will chat with David, then Precious, who chats with Dorian. We then come together at the end for a panel discussion and questions sent in from you, the audience. So please send in your questions from Stadium and tweet using the hashtag OU1984. And now I'll hand over to Geoff and David. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Donna. And I guess it's appropriate that we're doing this session by telescreens. We're delighted to discuss 1984 in the company of one of Orwell's biographer. And I wanted to ask David to start with What was there in Orwell's early life, in his schooling, family background, that remained particularly influential for him, do you think, in the writing of 1984?
It's a very interesting question. Orwell once said of the American writer Jack London that he could foresee fascism because he had a fascist streak in himself. And although I wouldn't labour that point too prodigiously with regard to Orwell, we have to remember that he was effectively a son of the Raj, and his whole career was predicated on the idea of empire, imperial service. And we do know, I think it is possible to say that he did have a kind of a slight authoritarian streak that could only have been planted fairly on in his career. But the key piece of evidence with regard, I think, to the impact of his early life on the writing, on the making of 1984 and the world it embodies, is the famous essay Such Were the Joys, which is about his career at Cyprian's prep school near Eastbourne, mostly during the years of the Great War. And as it's a very odd piece of writing because we don't know when it was written. We only know that it was written sometime in the 1940s. It could have been written before 1984. It could have been written. It could have been written in conjunction with it. We just cannot date it. And the thing about St Cyprian's, a boys' preparatory school on the Sussex coast, is it is effectively presented as a totalitarian state. Where the headmaster is the tyrant, the dictator, and there's on several occasions, Orwell, recasting his younger self, says that if you went out to buy a packet of sweets, the headmaster's spies would be after you. And the interesting thing about this is it works both ways, and that when you come to read 1984, particularly the passages in which Winston is interrogated by O'Brien, a trap having been sprung on him. O'Brien is several times described as being rather like a headmaster, rather like a schoolmaster trying to encourage a promising but slightly wayward boy, this kind of thing. So I can't, as I say, it's impossible to produce a definitive conclusion about that essay. On the one hand, you could say that 1984 is the projection of Orwell's infant misery. On the other hand, you could say that when he started thinking about 1984, it encouraged him to recast his school days in a kind of totalitarian form. But there's obviously a relationship between those two pieces of writing. And together they say something very profound, if not about the way in which Orwell's childhood actually happened, but the way in which he thought about that childhood, and then how he projected it into the world of 1984.
Yeah, and actually that generation of writers that he comes from, Cyril Connolly being another one, talk a lot about their early school life. Also, people who attended Gresham's school as well. That was obviously a sort of formative experience for him, as it was for Orwell.
I think it was that to your average upper class schoolboy at around that time, going to school, and though obviously Orwell didn't go there, going to university was in some ways the most intense experience of your life. I mean, Connolly himself, Orwell's great friend, said that really after he'd been to Eton and got a scholarship to Oxford, his life was really downhill all the way. And it's interesting. Orwell, of course, is a kind of different. It's a different kettle of fish in that regard, in that he frankly slacked through his days at Eton and then went off and joined the Burma Police. So he sits rather to one side of that great contingent of early 20th century British intellectuals who never really got over their school days.
Just moving on a bit, David, in your biography, you say that Orwell's time in Spain was a defining experience for him and indeed influenced his view of totalitarianism. Why was that?
One of the great questions about Orwell biography is, the seed. When were the seeds sown of Orwell's political awakening? And it's always assumed, that in some cases it's assumed that he came home from Burma in 1927 as a fully fledged anti-imperialist with all his political opinions in place. Now, I found a letter last year in a cache that's only just become available, written to a girlfriend in 1931 from London, just at the point when the national government is forming, just at the point when we're going off the gold standard, crucial time in British history in the 1930s. And Orwell writes to his friend Eleanor, and he says, there's probably going to be civil unrest, social unrest here in London in the autumn, but I don't really know anything about it because I know nothing of, and I am not interested in politics. That was written in 1931. Even when he goes to Wigan in 1936, and he begins, he will write that Mr. So-and-so, who I met, is active in the Labour movement. And it's almost anthropological. Orwell doesn't really know what the Labour movement is, but he's concerned that he should investigate these curious people who are members of it. But it's when he gets to Spain, when he gets to revolutionary Barcelona in early 1937, that he suddenly sees, he imagines that he sees a society run on properly egalitarian lines, and it takes his breath away. And I think that it forms, it's the crucible in which most of his later political opinions were forged.
Yeah, and as you say, he wasn't, as is the case of South Wales miners or Cambridge University students, he wasn't converted to communism before he went. Was interested in socialism, but as you say, in a very loose way. How significant was that then in helping him to maintain a more critical, independent position during and after Spain?
Well, as you say, he came to Spain not exactly cold, because there is that long polemical second half of the road to Wigan Pier where he tries to work out what he thinks about socialism. But he came to, and we know that, I mean, the remarks that he vouchsafed to people in the week before he went to Spain, they were not in the least ideological. He was saying to people, terrible isn't about the Spaniards. Something has to be done. Poor chaps, we have to get over there and help, without really knowing how he was going to help or what the situation was. And I think that the fact that he came to Spain with a relatively open mind and saw the sights that he saw in proto-revolutionary Barcelona in January 1937, it was that, I think, that helped him, that made him be so shocked 6 months later, when the Soviet squads are at work in Barcelona, and he gets out with his life, because he spent, and I've just been rereading some of the essays he wrote about Spain subsequently, looking back on the Spanish War, essays like that, and he says that he still can't actually work out what the Russians were up to. And it was as if, certainly we know that the Russians, the Soviet leadership thought that they didn't actually want a revolution in Spain in 1937 because it didn't serve their international purposes. And Orwell can't understand this because he'd seen what he regarded as conditions of, so far of social equality in a European country. And he thought that obviously it was the duty of everybody there to see that position was maintained and enhanced. He couldn't understand why anybody would want the Spanish Revolution to fail, especially somebody on the left.
You mentioned the road to Wigan Pier, and of course, in the second part of that book, he's very critical of left-wing intellectuals. He's critical of what he sees as their doctrinaire politics, the language they use, and contrasted that really with the experiences of ordinary citizens. And obviously, it was an early writing on socialism and on the left, although I think there were some themes he continued subsequently. But it was quite controversial at the time because, of course, the Spanish Civil War and the 30s generally saw some of the great causes of the left. And I was wondering, the later significance of this critique of intellectuals and how important that was in the work he did subsequently.
I think it's very important, and I think a lot of the work, a lot of the writings that he's doing at that point, Wigan Pier and the months and the years after it, are in a certain sense, you can see those later opinions being, coming to, not coming to grip, but beginning to incubate. As for the distaste for doctrinaire positions, either of left and right, only this morning, quite by chance, not actually not prepping for this particular conversation, but I read a fascinating review that he wrote of a book called English Ways by Jack Hilton. Now, Jack Hilton, as you doubtless know, was a very prominent, distinguished working class writer in the 1930s. He wrote another book called Caliban Shrieks, which is one of the great titles, for proletarian autobiography. And English Ways is the story of a journey. In fact, it's the road to Wigan Pier in reverse, because Hilton and his wife start out at Epsom, and then they tramp all the way up to the north of England. And Orwell really liked this book, and he liked it because of the individualistic spirit that Hilton showed. And Orwell tries to define his political position. And he says, Hilton is obviously a man of the left, but after you've said that, you realize that he's very idiosyncratic, and he likes having a bit of a flutter on the horses, and he loves it when he sees the king arriving at the Derby, and he's only disappointed that the king is in a motor car and not in a coach and six, and he says, and obviously from the point of view of the socialist intellectual, somebody like Jack Hilton is completely beyond the pale because he has no formal defined opinion. He will never nail his colours to any particular ideological mask, and yet he's an ordinary working man, and therefore his opinion counts. And I think that you can see this view being developed, and obviously Orwell's derision of the extreme left of the Communist Party in the early years of the war, who were dancing to a particular tune in 1939-40. And as soon as Russia was at war with Germany, had completely do a 180-degree turn and pretend they believed in something else. So I think you can see those ideas fermenting in the late 1930s.
And he's very critical of orthodoxies in Inside the Whale, his 1940 essay, and then subsequent writings.
That's right, the smelly little orthodoxies that are contending for our souls, that marvellous phrase.
That's right.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that, he takes it further, and obviously, it's a theme in 1984. And he suggests that while writers and intellectuals will support political parties, he was a political writer himself, he thought there were conflicts of interest if they became active party members. And that seemed to be, and again, of course, in his writing, Why I Write and The Prevention of Literature, that sort of theme comes again, that almost leading to partisan judgments that affect anyone's political analysis, it seems.
I agree. There's a very interesting thread goes through his work from about from the early 1940s to just after the war. He was obviously very interested in party politics during the war, and quite often attended debates at the House of Commons, knew various people who then became prominent in the Labour Party, Strauss, Bevan, people like that, great admirer of Sir Stafford Cripps. And then the note of disillusionment occurs fairly quickly. And I read the other day a marvellous description of Attlee, of course, the great Labour hero. Orwell came across Attlee about 1942 and said that he reminded him of a fish that's just been caught but not quite stiffened yet. And then, so having done that, post-1945, when you get a Labour administration in power, of whom one would suppose that Orwell would support, he stops really being interested in parliamentary politics. He's much more interested in causes. He's a great supporter of the Freedom Defence Committee. He gets in with several quite prominent anarchists like George Woodcock and Reg Reynolds and Vernon Richards, all of whom kind of made attempts to claim him as one of their own, while knowing that it didn't quite work. He sympathised with anarchism without ever quite being an anarchist. And so there is a way in which post-1945 he's much more interested in individual causes and protests and freedom of speech and individual liberties, rather than being sort of solidly behind the Attlee government and taking a serious interest in parliamentary politics. And I think this trust of orthodoxy is something on which that's predicated, and you can see it beginning at a very, very early stage in the Second World War, if not beforehand.
Yeah, he's much more sympathetic to Iron Bevan and when he was at Tribune than Attlee, and despite his socialism and the Lion and the Unicorn, etc., he's quite pessimistic. I think about Labour's chances in the run up to 1945. In that period, in the years before publication in 1984, lots going on in his life. He worked as a BBC Talks producer. He was a literary editor at Tribune. He was living on an isolated Scottish island. He lost his wife and, of course, was suffering from serious illness. And he's quite self-deprecating, but also pessimistic about the world, it seems, and gets to this, attracts a description of gloomy George, I think, at one point. How much does 1984 owe to this difficult period of his life?
Well, in terms of Orwell's career as a writer, which extends for about 20 years, and actual publications of full-length books start in 1933, one of the really significant things about 1984, and I'm sure Dorian Lynskey would agree with this one, is how long it took Orwell to write it and publish it. Most of his novels are written in a few months and published within a year. Owl Farm is only about 30,000 words long. That took 3 months to write, although he had great problems in publishing it. He got the idea for 1984 as early as the Tehran Conference of 1943. He started making notes for it around that time. He writes a few pages of it in 1945. He starts on a first draft in 1946. It's not finished until the end of 1948. It's not published till June 1949, nearly 6 years after it was begun. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is the chaos of his personal life at the time, adopting Richard, his first wife dying, the relocation to Jura that you talk about. Another is his serious ill health, which is getting worse and worse all the time. And, it's amazing in some ways that he lived as long as he did, given the state of his lungs. The other thing that I think it is that he's constantly refining what we'll call the intellectual armature of 1984. And so if you read the essays that he was writing for Horizon and Polemic and publications like that in the mid-1940s. And if you set them alongside the development of 1984, you can almost slot some of the ideas in as they were being conceived. I mean, for example, there's a wonderful essay that he wrote for Tribune just after the Second World War had ended called You and the Atom Bomb, where he sketches out this idea of, a future in which the world is divided into contending superstates, and because they all have nuclear weapons, you have a kind of hegemony that's the kind of shifting state, and Politics in the English Language, another one written for Cyril Connolly's Horizon in 1946, and so it's almost as if he's inching his way to the intellectual framework of the book as he's writing it, and the ideas are not fully formed really possibly until 1947 when he's at work on the final draft, and all the time sort of slipping in other bits of information that come to hand. I mean, there's the famous Julia's famous monologue in 1984 where she talks about where she sees a rat and then goes on, there are rats in the working class district. They bite the babies in the face. This sort of thing. Well, that was actually taken from an incident that happened on Jura in the spring of 1947 that he obviously read about in the local paper and thought, oh yes, I'll just slip that into the draft I was reading. So it's very, I suppose the word is palimpsestical. He's constantly refining it, adding new bits, taking other bits out. And it was a very difficult book for him to write. And I think he thought all his books were failures. And he thought in the end, his pronouncement was that 1984 was a good idea that he hadn't satisfactorily worked out. And I think if he'd had more time and lived longer, I think it might have taken on a yet more different complexion to its final iteration.
And of course, as with Animal Farm, his previous book, he had problems with publishers, with his regular publisher Gallant and so on, worried about the controversial nature of the book as the Cold War began to take shape. Can you just say something about the early reception of the book?
Well, you're quite right about the controversy. I mean, there's a very, in some ways, in retrospect, amusing letter from Frederick Warburg, from Secker & Warburg, who published 1984, saying that it was, one of the most terrifying books that he'd written, absolutely political on the mark. He also said it was worth 1 million votes to the Conservative Party. This is in 1949. And Orwell's fear, by no means a groundless fear, was that it would immediately be picked up by the American right and used as a stick to beat Soviet communism, which of course it was. But he thought this was a price worth paying. And there's a very interesting letter to him from a man who subsequently became a very famous American novelist, Sidney Sheldon, who at that point worked in Hollywood. And Sheldon wrote to him in the autumn of 1949, saying that he presumed that it was a satire on both wings of totalitarianism. It was as much anti-fascist as anti-communist. And Orwell wrote back to him very, very gratified and said, "You're absolutely right about this. And I just wish that this would be up more, especially in America, where I fear that that its target is going to be made to seem exclusive." And this, of course, is what happened. The only people who really hated it, of course, were the extreme left. And the review in Pravda is very funny if you ever want to look that one up about this filthy imperialist rubbish and so forth. But it was written at a very delicate time, one of the first of the Cold War novels. And he knew that it was going to be picked up and used by people for their own political ends. But I think he thought that the point so had to be made that this was a price worth paying for what would be done to it. And, the cartoons of Animal Farm and the CIA funding and all the rest of it.
Fascinating. Thanks, David. I think we're going to join again later, and I'll hand back to Don. Just before I hand back to Donna, I should say that we've made 1984 the set book on one of our new courses, Modern Political Ideas, because we think it's got everything in it, really. Political ideology, the role of elites, the state, and so on. And it's great to get this discussion at the same time as we're doing the course. Donna.
Thanks, Geoff. Thanks, David. Well, we've had a great background on Orwell the man and the kind of the beginnings of the novel. I think now it's probably a great point to hand over to Precious and Dorian to hear a bit more about the development of the book, the place of 1984 today, kind of contemporary politics and authoritarianism. So I'll now hand over to Precious, and then we'll come back together at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Donna. And thanks to Geoff and David for a really great introduction to the event as well. Dorian, one of the things that really struck me about your book, which I think would be quite useful to kind of start off with, is it's here, the Ministry of Truth, and it's described as A Biography of George Orwell's 1984. And it's kind of in three, well, it has three elements, right? So it's sort of got Orwell's biography, it's got the kind of background to the book, and then it talks about the afterlife of the book. So I wondered if you could maybe talk us through why it was that you wanted to take this quite, I guess, unusual approach to the topic, and what you think it adds to our understanding of 1984.
Well, I mean, there are. I came to it by trying to understand the kind of the origins of sort of quite familiar dystopian tropes. That you can do a generic dystopia in an advert or a cartoon, and I was just really intrigued by kind of how these ideas developed. And then, of course, 1984 is the kind of the junction box, which basically kind of all of the dystopias before that sort of feed into 1984, and then 1984 sort of overwhelms them all in a way. And so I like the idea of the biography of a book, which of course involves partly the biography of but there are some very good biographies of Orwell, including David's. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to be very sort of selective here and just go, okay, which parts of his life and his ideas are most relevant to the book? And that's actually very liberating, because you don't have to go into certain aspects of his life as deeply, his childhood, his love life, or whatever, as you would in a biography. But I did end up picking up on, for example, some of his film reviews, which are, mostly sort of forgotten, that were relevant to the book. And so it was just I found it like a really liberating way of just looking at both his life and then also the afterlife. And I suppose the big theme of the afterlife is misunderstandings and different interpretations. And I thought, well, you can't understand this book unless you understand Orwell's life and also what he was reading, what he was thinking about, who he was talking to, all of those early influences. And I just thought, well, why not do all of these things? And basically, because you're telling the life of a book.
It's really interesting, actually, and the way you kind of describe it also makes me think of something David said a little while ago, that 1984 wasn't written quickly, and you can kind of see those links through his life, and it's something you do mention quite a lot in the book, is these kind of formative experiences that then you can see much later on emerging in 1984, which I do think comes out really clearly. And I think you do list a lot of examples of how Orwell kind of linked his personal experience with some sort of authenticity for his writing, and kind of actively put himself into probably either unpleasant or challenging situations like homelessness, arrest, fighting in the Spanish Civil War, for example, that he then went on to write about. And I wondered whether you think, was that, directly to feed his art, or was it predominantly kind of politically motivated, and then the writing ended up as a sort of function of that?
Well, I suppose there's a third motivation, which is it was sort of, psychologically motivated, is that he wanted to be part of things. He wanted to be part of the world. And so if you think about him going to Burma, he did end up writing, a couple of very famous essays and a novel about Burma, but nobody joins the Imperial Police for several years in order to get a book out of it. So that was very much just like he wanted the experience. Wrote a Wigan Pier, that was a work of kind of reportage that was commissioned. And then sometimes it becomes a little unclear, like there's actually two conflicting accounts of his motives for going to Spain. In one, and I can't remember if this was in his own words or this was kind of his contemporaries explaining what he told them. And in one of them, he went to write a book or to write some articles and ended up getting sort of swept up in the whole cause. And in another, it's like he wanted to fight for a cause and then realized that he could write about it. And those things are so inseparable. It almost doesn't matter which came first, because basically within a few days he was doing both. But it does speak to, I think, one of the things about Orwell as a novelist is that he didn't really, and as a journalist, which I think is quite admirable, is that he didn't really like writing about things that he didn't have a very, very strong understanding of. And when there are things that he could not experience, so he never experienced life under a totalitarian regime. The closest he got was sort of visiting Germany with the Allied troops, at the end of the war. So it was just in the immediate aftermath of a totalitarian regime, and the few days he spent in Barcelona, where it had this very kind of police state atmosphere. So he read exhaustively. He wasn't a bluffer in a way that many journalists are, and they just think, well, I can sort of, read quickly and zhuzh up and give the impression that I know what I'm talking about. It really mattered to him that he knew. And so when it comes to sort of 1984, virtually everything in that book is based on something he'd experienced. Sometimes going back years, there's a description of a kind of, I think, a blocked toilet in a cell, which was something that he'd experienced when he'd been arrested, in the 30s, in the kind of down there at Paris and London period. And, obviously The Office, the Ministry of Truth, is based on the BBC, the physicality of that. And so it's just something very kind of concrete about him. He really valued concrete things, and he valued experience and first-hand knowledge, which feeds into both his journalism and his fiction.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You talk about, some of those particular experiences that he had, and in the book you say that Orwell felt that he lived in cursed times, and I was wondering, do you think this is an accurate reflection of the pretty dramatic times he lived through, or is it partly because of, the way in which he found himself in specific situations? Or I'm kind of thinking now as well of increased political polarization across the US and the UK, and I wonder whether it's some sort of natural conceit of politically engaged people to catastrophize about the latest political hurdle as if it's of, supreme relevance.
I don't think so. I think that there's a kind of, like in Coming Up for Air, he talks about this nostalgia, the character's nostalgia, and to some extent his nostalgia for the kind of the world, the Edwardian age, the world before the First World War. And he was going, in many ways that, it wasn't better because, women didn't have the vote, or, the conditions of the working class were terrible, more terrible. But he was saying that what they had that we don't have is sort of faith in the future, that they had hope. And he's really interesting on nostalgia and almost sort of when is nostalgia legitimate. And I think in the late 30s, it was totally legitimate to think that an era which gave you Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini was worse. You get that in Malcolm Muggeridge's book, The 30s. You get that in Auden, writing about the low dishonest decade. There's really sort of no way to kind of, I don't know, to see the sunny side of the late 30s. And I kind of feel that now, I think there's a kind of idea. Some people get very annoyed when people talk about, say, the Olympics opening ceremony in 2012, or any period, sort of pre-2016 period, which felt nicer. And they go, well, there was still austerity, there was still inequality, there was still, foreign wars and so on. And all of this but it was better than having Trump in the White House and what has happened to our politics since 2016. So I do think it's possible to sort of to go, no, the time we're looking through is particularly bad. But in his case, that actually fed, it sort of brought out, I suppose, his sort of genius. He had this weird idea, I think, that if times were better, then he could have just been a novelist and poet and had lived a purely literary life. But he wasn't a very good poet, and he was quite a limited novelist. But he was a kind of genius essayist. And of course, his best novels, are the ones in which he's trying to sort of explain the present and the recent past. So it's a weird one that he did feel cursed, but of course that was what enabled him to be the figure that he was.
Okay. This you kind of mentioned, the times that we're living in and the Trump in the White House, etc., and to me that's interesting because you start the book that way, so you kind of put a juxtaposition between the circumstances of Orwell finishing the book in 1948 and the incoming Trump administration's references to alternative facts surrounding the inauguration attendance figures in 2017. And you basically point out that despite predictions to the contrary, 1984 has endured not only in relevance but in cultural ubiquity, and then it almost becomes kind of increasingly relevant in cycles as the political context changes. So I was going to ask you, what do you think are the main kind of sources of the book's appeal? Why is it that it becomes relevant again and again in this kind of cyclical fashion?
Well, I think on one level, it's the fact that so many people read it, because it is a gripping read. It's sort of, it's sort of bleak and tense. It's got enough of the qualities of a thriller. It's very appealing if you're a teenager. It's one of the classic novels that it's not hard to grasp, and it gives you a great sort of sense of, you know, of drama. But then in terms of, I suppose, it's cultural. So basically, a lot of people have read it. It's not one of those books that people sort of reference via the, you know, the Wikipedia entry. But then the language, I think Orwell's, the real innovation in the language is to give people Big Brother and Thought Police and doublethink. And those things, and this happened within sort of weeks of the book coming out. These things started to crop up in the House of Commons and in newspapers. And so immediately that language sort of carried the book. So even people that don't know the book that well will pick up on the language. And then I think the third factor is it's got different themes which rise to the top at different periods in history. So initially, it's people were largely thinking about totalitarianism. What are you saying here about Stalinism? And to sort of lesser extent to sort of, you know, Nazism. And then at later times, people will be thinking more about surveillance and what it's saying about technology. And I think in the Trump era, in the era of, you know, disinformation, people worry more about what it says about truth, which is why I chose ended up choosing the title I did, because I thought, yeah, this is the part of the book that is most important now. Whereas I think if you look back at the way it was being discussed in 1949 or in 1968 or in 1984 itself, actually what they're talking about, mate, is not the truth aspect. It's not the disinformation aspect. That wasn't what felt most relevant to them at that time. And I think that's what makes it so enduring, is that at any point in the last 70 odd years, there's always some aspect of it that seems incredibly topical, even if some other aspects don't.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And I have to say that, I mean, in general, when you read the book, because of Winston Smith's job in the Ministry of Truth's Records Department, we get a pretty comprehensive insight into, you know, the management of memory in an authoritarian regime. And this was one of the things that particularly spoke to me, because, you know, the idea of, so my research is on the Russian political elite, and I look at how they engage with national memory over time. And we've seen exactly this kind of process of basically managing memory in politically expedient ways. And so over the October Revolution centenary, there were these massive cinematic attempts to kind of build its mythology in ways that essentially kind of legitimize the contemporary ruling elite. And I found that for me, these kind of themes really came out in the book. And as you say, with that being a particularly hot topic now in terms of truth and memory and how we can kind of trust the evidence of our own eyes and ears, I suppose. And so kind of leading on from that, I was thinking, you know, looking at Orwell's whole back catalogue, it's pretty clear that he was not just obsessed with authoritarianism, but not the authoritarians themselves, but rather kind of what it is that makes people go along with them, that kind of decay of consensus reality.
Right.
And so I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about that and why you think this kind of, you know, speaks to us now, and what you think he was looking at in particular at the time.
Well, what he's really interested in is not, it's, I suppose, complicity and different ways of living under a system like that. And I think each character represents a different way of living under totalitarianism. So Winston's problem, in a sense, is that he begins to reject it, is that he can't go along anymore. Julia, who actually, when I was reading about kind of studies of how many kind of Soviet citizens behaved, particularly in later decades, you know, as the sort of system was failing, they mostly behaved like Julia, as in they kind of mouthed the platitudes and they followed the rules, but they just didn't believe in them anymore. And actually, the kind of O'Briens, the real fanatics, were in a minority, and you also see like the other people that work with Winston, like Parsons and Syme. They're all sort of different. They all have sort of different strategies on how to sort of live under totalitarianism, but they're all kind of warped and broken And I think sometimes people forget how messed up Winston is at the beginning. His view of things, the way that he talks about, the video that he sees of the Jewish refugees being bombed, the way that he talks about women. There's something he's been very distorted from by the system, and he sort of has to break out of that and redeem himself in a way. And the most important thing about the proles is that at first he thinks why they're so important is because they're going to rise up one day. And then finally, just before he gets captured, he realizes that the hope lies in the proles because they've remembered how to be human. And he thinks that everybody else, sort of including himself and Julia and sort of everyone in the party, in some ways has lost an essential humanity. He's obviously trying to get his back. But it's about the fact, I suppose, it's about avoiding doublethink. It's avoiding being complicit, which I think, of course, is very, very hard in a genuine police state. I think it becomes very hard because, there are all these kind of risks, and not everybody can be a rebel, knowing where many rebels end up. Mm-hmm. But I think really what he's talking about, and really what the rebellion is, it's so much of the drama of the book takes place in Winston's head. It's like, can he hold on to the belief that 2 + 2 = 4? Can he hold on to his love for Julia? All these things are quite small but vital battles, and so seeing the prole washerwoman singing a song and kind of redeeming with a sort of humanity, redeeming this manufactured song and making it seem to sort of have genuine emotion and warmth and joy. That is something quite small, and that's got nothing to do with an underground network of dissidents bringing down the system. But, I think Orwell is saying that's the battle, the most important battle you have to win.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. And then it makes me kind of want to ask about, this idea of the humanity and of avoiding complicity, I guess. And one thing I think that comes across really strongly in the book is the way in which Orwell had certain convictions that didn't necessarily gain or keep him friends in particular areas, so he wouldn't toe a party line, for example.
Yeah.
And I wondered if, is this an element of Winston that we, is Orwell there within Winston? Is that something that he particularly, wanted to convey? Or
I think maybe there is an important difference between, I think, the journalism and the book. And the point of the book is this sort of satirical exaggeration. So it's so extreme, that the pressure that Winston is under is so extreme. Mm-hmm. And what can seem to him like an act of rebellion, which is simply like buying a notepad, having sex in a field. These are quite sort of small things. And obviously, Orwell lived in a democracy. And I think it's in the journalism. And I think there are some editions of 1984 where they add on some of the relevant articles. And that's where you sort of see him extrapolate some of the ideas in 1984 and how they might apply in a democracy. And those are the things that I think sometimes it can be very relevant now, because then you're talking about, okay, the kind of, how do you balance certain liberties? What is the importance of free speech? Things like that, which in the sort of constrained world of 1984, it's like, well, obviously there is no free speech, there is no liberty. And so I feel like I wish maybe I would love people who like 1984 to sort of read more of those kind of crucial essays, because that's where 1984 is a very condensed book. Mm-hmm. It's basically years and years of thinking and reading and writing that gets compressed into this book. But it's also worth sort of unpacking and looking at the ways, I suppose, the things that are more relevant to our lives than somebody who lives in a kind of an all-powerful totalitarian regime.
Okay. And that actually also brings me into a question more related to the contemporary environment, which is that, Orwell does a great job in 1984 of predicting the kind of all-encompassing surveillance technology, and he never, equated technology as progress and saw the potential detrimental effects of it. But if we look at how we consume media and technology in today's world, it's clear that many of us essentially opt into surveillance technologies, and they're not governed by an authoritarian state apparatus, but by corporate technology giants.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, does this make this kind of authoritarian surveillance state that Orwell predicted more or less likely to come to pass? And, which variant do you think he would have been more afraid of, essentially?
Well, we're not very careful. And I think obviously Orwell lived in an era where all the stuff was totalitarian, and there were reasons why, that the state was the biggest danger, because, radio, it wasn't the era of pirate radio and everybody being able to sort of broadcast. It was like, well, the only people that had money, and he actually said this, he was like, well, when radio becomes cheaper and there can be more voices, then radio won't be as sinister a force as he thought it was at the time, because it was just control. It could only be run by the sort of state. And so, of course, it's really important to remember that he was writing in the totalitarian era with the technology of that time. And the idea that you would have all this kind of proliferating, sort of voices and channels of communication, and that people would actually sort of willingly surrender their data, which is somebody who was very, very private, would have sort of blown his mind. Is obviously something that he would, it's sort of, you can't quite foresee, is that people would sort of give this stuff away, and that people aren't very careful, and that when there was a staged version of 1984 a few years ago where they did an experiment where they got people to sign up to an app where they got like bonus goodies, and the small print said that they'd given information to hand over all of their social media posts, and it was basically just to show people, shock people into realizing that they don't look at the small print, because their pictures were being broadcast in the foyer, projected in the foyer. And they thought, the people who did this, that actually a lot of people were very, very angry, and they would feel very invaded by this. And they said, in fact, overwhelmingly, people were delighted, and they were like, it's my picture on the wall. So this sort of experiment scared people into being more, proved that people actually didn't care that much about privacy, and and the way that it is rebranding now the virtues of transparency, which you can actually find in quite early utopian and dystopian novels. Weirdly, go back to the 19th century. The dystopia that really explains that mindset is probably Dave Eggers' book, The Circle. It's like how much people would sort of willingly give away. And so there's so much that so many of the threats that we have now do not come from the big state, and yet you look at China, and that's where the tools of surveillance capitalism meet a fairly old-fashioned kind of authoritarian state, and so it's the merger of the two. And I think that we have a real-life example of what happens when sort of big tech and Big Brother combine. And it should make us a little less complacent about what we do with our data.
So, Dorian, you talked about how one of the things that makes 1984 so relevant is the way in which there's so many elements of it that kind of seem to make sense at particular different points in history. And one of the things that spoke particularly to me was the way that Orwell predicted surveillance technology. He never equated technology as being just about progress, and he saw the potential pitfalls in terms of how it could influence, nationalism and dictatorship. But if we look at today's world, many of us basically opt into surveillance technologies that aren't governed by an authoritarian state apparatus, but by corporate technology giants. So I wanted to ask you, do you think this kind of authoritarian surveillance, this kind of corporate opt-in surveillance makes the kind of authoritarian surveillance state that Orwell predicted more or less likely to come to pass? And which variant do you think he would have been most afraid of?
Well, I think obviously it makes it more likely because it gives people greater tools. Orwell was interested in how technology could be abused by authoritarians. So he had a kind of rather sort of gloomy view of, what aircraft. I said, I talk about H.G. Wells' sort of faith in technology, and he goes, well, look, we got aeroplanes. They mainly seem to be used for dropping bombs. We've got radio that mainly seems to be used for sort of pumping out propaganda. So he was always aware in a way that some of the utopians were not so aware of how technology could be abused. So even though he didn't have a television at the time, and not many people did, and he didn't even bother to sort of work out how the telescreen worked, there's really nothing on the sort of technology there. He was thinking, well, look, if a TV exists, this is a way that it could be abused. And so he would have been, very interesting in the sort of utopian phase of the internet in the 90s. He would have been very skeptical and gone, well, why do you think that freeing up information and giving everybody the ability to be their own sort of broadcasters, why would you assume that that's going to lead to more freedom? Why would you assume that's not going to be kind of manipulated and abused? And what I think he would also have been quite shocked by, because he was very sort of private, very cagey about his information. Anybody else getting his hands on his sort of papers and letters and so on, is he'd be surprised how willing people are to surrender their data. And essentially the whole sort of big tech, not so much Apple, but companies like Google and Facebook, their whole business model is taking your data and using that for sort of behavioral modification. And everybody sort of knows that, but they don't necessarily think through the implications. And, when you look at Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, it's really not surprising that she mentions Orwell a lot and that she describes surveillance capitalism as big other. Because, there's no doubt that that there is a sort of an Orwellian quality to this. And I think perhaps because in democracies, you think, well, what does it matter? What's it matter if, because of Google Maps, people know where I've been? Well, of course, it doesn't matter that much in the current regime that we live under. But if you look at China, it's extremely high tech, and it basically uses the tools of surveillance capitalism and combines them with, practices that go back to Mao. So you've got it's a high tech police state. And if you look at what's happening with the Uyghurs in, say, Xinjiang, I mean, that is what happens when you combine those two things. And I think because we don't have the police state bit, we are rather sort of complacent about the surveillance bit and where our data goes. And it's very hard to opt out of that. You can't opt out of a, CCTV camera as you walk down the street. But what I think, I suppose writing the books and talking to people about this stuff certainly made me more worry about, facial recognition and sort of things like that. And I think all of those things would have intrigued Orwell. The other big difference, I suppose, is that the disinformation we have is not coming from one state. We don't have this totalitarian state that goes, this is the truth, keeps changing the truth every day, but it's all coming through this one channel. And instead what we have is what Steve Bannon described as flooding the zone with shit, which is I'm sure the Russians had a nicer way of putting it, but there's a version of that as well, which is you create this sort of mind state, like as Hannah Arendt called it, nothing is true and everything is possible, where you just sort of dismantle the idea of objective truth at all. And that in itself can be incredibly dangerous, even without one central authority telling you to believe this or that. It's almost it's the breaking down of.
Yeah, this kind of nightmare scenario where objective truth breaks down. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. It is, but it doesn't need to be broken down by INGSOC. It doesn't need to be broken down by one regime to be dangerous.
And I think that's another reason it becomes interesting today, isn't it? Because, in Orwell's vision, it's, there's one kind of clear anti-truth being put forward, and it might change over time, but it's clear at any one point what that alternative vision is supposed to be. Whereas in today's environment, we're constantly bombarded with hyper-partisan alternative truths from all directions, whether that's, political fringes within a state or external actors kind of meddling. which of those kind of nightmares do you think is more corrosive to the truth?
Well, I think perhaps because of the 1984 model, which is so popular, and I think people forget how much it was modelled on totalitarianism. There's almost this idea that it was, I'm sure if you saw the slogan, "Make Orwell fiction again," to which the response is like, well, it wasn't really fiction. I mean, it was based in reality. So I think people forget how much of it was it was really modelled on kind of mid-20th century totalitarianism. But that's not the only threat. And so when Facebook was called upon to take more of an active role preventing disinformation, one of their top guys said, well, we don't want to become the Ministry of Truth. And I thought, well, that's interesting that they think that the danger is that Facebook will become the Ministry of Truth, responsible for disinformation, whereas simply what it would be doing would be just trying to stem the flow of all these kind of boutique ministries of truth, whether that be kind of, proactive sort of, Russian disinformation, or just, your conspiracy theorist uncle, pumping all of this disinformation out. And I think sometimes we struggle with this sort of model that the danger sort of truth can come through all these small sources, and it doesn't an all-powerful big brother figure. It doesn't have to be INSOC. And so you often find conspiracy theorists who believe all kinds of pernicious nonsense, but to them it's like that's better than the BBC, because the BBC is the Orwellian body. And I think that is perhaps a way in which an obsession with 1984 can mislead us. Because, of course, the threats that we face now are not exactly the same as the threat posed by Stalin and Hitler.
Great. Well, I think on this slightly pessimistic note, I suppose, it might be a good time to pass back to Donna and open it up to the audience, who I'm sure will have plenty of questions related to these kind of themes. So thanks very much, Dorian.
Thank you, Precious, and thank you, Dorian. It's fascinating to see how the book's developed and how it's kind of relevant today. And we want to kind of move to a wider discussion with the panel now. We've been collating your questions and also kind of looking on Twitter as well, and we'll get to as many as we can. Just to say, if anyone's live stream cut out, don't worry, we were recording, so anything you miss will be made available to you after event, so nothing is lost, nothing's been chucked down the memory hole. We're fine. So lots of questions to get going with, and I'll kind of move between all the speakers and try and make things as relevant as possible. First of all, a question for David. Orwell claimed the novel was not an attack on any particular government. You could have mentioned that earlier, but a satire on totalitarian tendencies in Western societies. He said the moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you. Can you give us a bit more information on Orwell's actual intentions, perhaps versus how his intentions have been interpreted?
His actual intentions when he was writing it, in some ways it's a very interesting continuation of Animal Farm, because you can see that in that satire of the Soviet Revolution, which is taken right up to the early part of the war, and it's almost as if Orwell sort of set down the totalitarian world of the Soviet Union with the end of Animal Farm, and then picked it up almost the next minute with the famous conferences between Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill that kind of divided, even 18 months before the Second World War had ended, the Allied leaders were already beginning to divide up, to divvy up the post-war world. And I think that was his starting point. And, he sort of predicated what then happened on that. So he's, on the one hand, he's consciously satirizing or exposing various aspects of life in the Soviet Union. I mean, particularly, Robert Conquest, the famous anti-Soviet historian, wrote a book about Stalin's Great Terror, and he details that many of the things that Orwell puts in 1984, were happening in the Soviet Union. I mean, particularly, the pioneers, the Soviet youth movement, being asked to denounce their parents if they thought they were ideologically suspect. So you can see him bringing all these aspects of specific things that were happening in the Soviet Union into 1984, while in the background lurks the wider spectrum, I suppose, of international power politics and the shape they were taking post-1945, where, going back to that essay, You and the Atom Bomb, where he kind of foresaw a sort of international hegemony whereby the peace would be kept by everybody having nuclear weapons, but not being prepared to use them. And this, he reckoned, would enable large sort of modern imperial states to lord it over smaller satellite states. So you've got the bigger international picture going on in the back of 1984, and you've got the specific depravities being enacted by what is, pretty obviously based on life in the Soviet Union, insofar as he could extrapolate it in from the point of view of, an English writer far away from what was really going on.
Thanks, that's really interesting. I think kind of to build on that, a question for you, Dorian. Again, we've touched on some of this, but the book was written a long time ago, obviously, and it's interesting to think about its reception in different times and in different regimes, such as kind of Cold War countries. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about the reception and it's in different places and different regimes?
Well, there's a really interesting thing that happened with. There's an interesting contrast between what a lot of the kind of Stalinist left in Britain and America made of it, and what people who were actually living behind the Iron Curtain made of it. And so you had the kind of the sort of hardliners in the West going, oh, he doesn't understand anything, and this is just Western propaganda, because that was the party line in the Pravda review that David mentioned. And then there's these really kind of fascinating and very moving accounts from people who were living in Eastern Europe and Russia about what it felt like to read a kind of forbidden copy. And it starts in the sort of early 50s with an account of Soviet officials who were just amazed that he'd got it so right, considering he'd never been there. And there's an account by, I think, a Polish or Czech dissident in the 80s, writing about how he felt reading 1984 was like how Winston feels reading Goldstein's book. So he was reading a forbidden book about a man reading a forbidden book about a police state inside a police state, and that he was moved to tears because he was like, I can't believe that somebody knows what I've been going for, what I'm living through. We talk a lot about the importance of representation and how people should be able to sort of see their experiences in books and in films. And this was sort of life-changing for them. It was the book that sort of explained their lives to them. And I think that's a sort of value that really, the importance of that just made the sort of criticisms from the kind of the sort of British Stalinists just evaporate. It was like, this is the proof of the pudding. And the fact is, Orwell never went to Russia. So it really is testimony to how much he understood and how much he listened and read and just devoured every scrap of information he could about what life was like under totalitarianism.
I'm going to bring a slightly kind of more contemporary now, and I think I'll ask this question to Dorian as well. We had a question come in from an audience member, from Richard. Orwell worried about the state enabled by technology cancelling the individual, but not society doing so. When some people use technology to cancel others, one wonders what 1984 has to say about contemporary cancel culture and the democratization of the memory hole. So how about kind of, 1984 and contemporary cancel culture? What do you think the kind of, how can we link that back to the novel? What does it have to say perhaps about what's going on nowadays? And I think particularly we mentioned this earlier, the notion of kind of, the left and kind of progressive doublethink, etc.
Well, I mean, the novel itself doesn't really have anything to say about that because we don't live in a... I repeat myself, but we don't live in a totalitarian regime, and I think actually to get what he might think about that, about issues such as freedom of speech, you have to go to some of his journalism and his idea that, for example, his ideas about his essays about Dali, he's writing about Ezra Pound, and just this idea of kind of, the art and the artist, and how much should people be penalised for saying certain things, because Ezra Pound, I suppose, was a victim of 1940s cancel culture, but rightly so, because he was a fascist. And Orwell's very good on sort of, well, you can accept that his poetry is good if that's your kind of thing. It wasn't Orwell's kind of thing. But also people have to take responsibility for their speech. So his ideas on this are sort of very nuanced. And I feel like, considering that there are so many people who live in very oppressive regimes now, I think there is something quite offensive about the way that sort of 1984 is applied to whether you should rename Colston Hall in Bristol, for example. That came up in an event I did. Or whether a celebrity gets sort of mobbed on Twitter. And you can certainly criticize all of those things. And I often, not the rename of Colston Hall, but you can certainly criticize some of the behavior of the left, some of the writing, some of the groupthink. But it's really important to distinguish that, I think, from the sort of the real suffering and the real oppression that was Orwell's theme in 1984. And it bugs me somewhat when I see a lot of people on the right using 1984, applying 1984 to really quite trivial, relatively trivial phenomena, which of course can be debated and criticised, but they should be kept in perspective.
Precious, I'll bring you in here from a kind of political, studies standpoint. Authoritarianism is often linked to the right, but what about the left? What do you think? What do we have to say about that in relation to the novel and kind of contemporary political culture?
I think one of the key things that the novel kind of makes clear is that it's, in a way, it's less about the system and more about how people react within that system. I mean, that's kind of relevant whether it's on the left or the right. And there are kind of, if we look at the contemporary age, we can see sort of sliding processes towards authoritarianism even in democratic societies. And really, I think our key concern needs to be, how do we respond to that? And it isn't necessarily the case that we have one actor creating these challenges in society. So, US elections is a really good example of this. And it's a huge number of actors kind of undermining democratic processes in ways of their own and in ways that feed negatively into one another. But the key element of that is how people respond to it. So how far are people willing to go to actually sustain their own democratic rights? Are they willing to sustain general democratic rights even when that might come up with an outcome that's not particularly pleasant to them, for example? And I think that these are the key challenges that we're seeing now, for example, because, it's very easy to mobilize this dramatic notion of, state oppression, for example, when really, as Dorian said, it doesn't accurately reflect what's actually going on within societies, but it's a very easy way to mobilize fear that can genuinely get people to act in ways that they perhaps otherwise wouldn't. And I think that can be where the key danger comes nowadays.
I'll bring Geoff in here, actually. I mean, do you think, Geoff, that it's harder to fight authoritarianism today because of, a potential loss of trust in the role of the media?
But just before I come on to that, Donna, I just want to go back to something that Dorian said a short time ago in response to one of the questions. I know that in his book, he points out that there's 110 mentions of the word remember, 47 mentions of memory, 46, I think, forgotten. And it just emphasizes the importance in totalitarian societies of, who controls the past. And of course, Winston's resistance is to keep a diary. And although I take completely Dorian's point about not conflating two, different kinds of societies, totalitarian societies and democracies, Orwell also says, I think it was in the Prevention of Literature, that to be corrupted by totalitarianism, one does not have to live in a totalitarian society. So even in democracies, you see perhaps, elements of that. The debate over, who controls the narrative is still very much a live political issue, whether we're talking about statues or Churchill or so on. Spending too long on Twitter, it's quite easy to come across 2 minutes hate. But we're not trivializing it to make those points. I think if we think about how easy it is to be, and I will also reiterate the point I made earlier about orthodoxies and partisan allegiances, and how, for example, social media, not only, but social media generates and reinforces those positions, which do affect truth and our understanding of, of politics, and ultimately our trust in the political system. So, there's so many things we can take from 1984, but I think that on one hand we can trivialize it and take it out of context, but we can also learn from it at the same time, I think.
Thanks, Geoff. That's really interesting. I'd like to kind of go back a little bit actually to the actual text itself and bring David in again. I mean, I always find 1984 quite a shocking book, a fantastic read, but also kind of really impactful. But in the appendix, there's also hope. And as this is a spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, with the suggestion that the regime was defeated in the end. Can you tell us a little bit about that appendix? Because it's perhaps not as well known as the kind of the main text of the book.
Yes, the appendix is very interesting. I mean, there are several. Dorian mentioned earlier, that there is this. That it's not an entirely pessimistic novel, because there is this assumption, or there is this kind of hope that the proles will rise, that the proles are the only, the proles will ultimately rise and overturn the regime, which incidentally led Evelyn Waugh to write a letter to Orwell saying he got it completely wrong and that's not where the future lay. And there was no hope in the proles. It was the educated middle classes who were going to make the change. But that was just his opinion. No, the appendix at the end is interesting because you kind of get the feeling that this is a fairly scholarly essay about Newspeak and how it works, but it's written retrospectively. And so the assumption is that this all happened in the past and now something else has taken its place. And this is now regarded in the way that we would regard a sort of, a Victorian dictionary full of archaisms, that the world, that language has moved on, the world has moved on with it. And so whoever has written it is looking back from a position substantially different from that which was going on in the world of 1984. So that too is a kind of suggestion that all wasn't quite as bleak as some of the original reviewers, or it should be said, I think, that some of the original responses to it, from both to the book and to the television version which came out very soon afterwards in the early 1950s. I mean, it was reported that proofs had been distributed to a conference of booksellers, 2 months before it was published, and many of them were sort of so terrified that they sort of complained that something so shocking had been given to them. And I remember my father telling me that my grandmother watched the original TV dramatization in, I think, 1953, and was petrified, even by an old black and white sort of live broadcast BBC television drama, the impact that it has, and its kind of lurid and hallucinogenic quality that people detected. It was terribly upsetting at the time for readers and viewers.
Can you perhaps give a bit more detail as well, David, about Orwell's experience of the publication of the novel and the reception of it? I know we have touched on this. Perhaps some of his opinions on kind of how it was received, etc. Politically at the time.
Politically, he was very gratified by the way in which it was received. I mean, it transformed. The great tragedy, of course, was that it transformed his life and his prospects at precisely the wrong time. He was sitting there in a hospital bed, only a few months from death, and suddenly, huge amounts of money are beginning to pour in from overseas rights and sales and royalties. And he would sit there in his emaciated state, sitting up in bed in University College Hospital, saying to friends, this is fairy gold. There will be no prospect of my ever living to enjoy it. I can only dispose of it in the best way that I can. He was very gratified by the political reception. I mean, Orwell being Orwell, he was never surprised when the particular political worms he had attacked turned. So, the fact that there's a telephone just started ringing. I must take this off the hook. Hang on. Sorry about this. Done it. Sorry about that. Sorry, everybody listening. No, so he was not in the least surprised by the attacks that came upon which were produced against it by the hard left. But he was sufficiently perturbed by the reception in America, whereas I think we were saying earlier that it was simply, he knew that it was going to be as a stick used by the right and the CIA to beat the left. And he was sufficiently perturbed by the reception it got in the States to issue a kind of statement. This was prompted by a letter to him from the representative of an American labor union, saying that the book was not specifically an attack on the Soviet Union. He didn't want it to be interpreted as that, but it was an attack on totalitarian tendencies generally. So I think that was one of his sort of last interventions, I think, in the debate that was sparked by 1984, and then, of course, continued for months and years after he died in the January of 1950.
Yeah. So could I say
Sure.
that?
Yeah, please come in.
Because in that same statement, he's basically going, it's not an attack on the British Labour Party, which a lot of the American reviewers didn't really understand what Labour was. They just thought it was this party. And that, they thought that, sort of Attlee was Big Brother or something. And of course, Orwell actually meant to be street. The Labour Party was too. He wanted to abolish, private schools and the House of Lords, and he was in a way kind of, he would have been harsher if he was than Attlee was, and it was just such a weird idea that the American, the right magazines like Time and Life that were run by very conservative people, thought that the whole thing was this sort of brutal satire on the post-war Labour government. And I think that was the thing that, that was the thing that really shocked Orwell, and sort of he had to sort of say something in these press releases. But it really sets up the life of the book, in that as soon as it came out, people were misunderstanding it. And that sort of gives you sort of fair warning, I think, and gave Orwell fair warning that there were always going to be people that were going to read this in ways that he did not intend.
I mean, we have to remember the political situation in the UK when it was written. I mean, I think I made the point earlier that the first thing that Fred Warburg, his publisher, read and Fred Warburg, of course, was regarded as Trotskyist on the end of the Labour Party, said, this is worth 1 million votes to the Conservative Party. At a time when political passions were running very high, a Labour government was running out of steam. So in some ways, it's perfectly obvious that it should be used in that very crude, reductive way as political propaganda.
Thanks, and I want to kind of just link a little bit back to kind of what Orwell kind of the reception, and also kind of what he perhaps foresaw. I mean, what didn't he foresee? I mean, he talked about the notion of kind of double think, etc. And I know some people kind of relate that to kind of cancel culture, which we can kind of agree or disagree with. But he kind of had he's known to kind of foresee certain things, whether it was his intention or not, or we see him foreseeing things. But what didn't he foresee? And I think also it'd be good to hear from kind of Precious perhaps here as well, about kind of perhaps linking it to kind of contemporary politics and kind of how we interact with the novel.
I think one of the key, it's very insightful, the novel, and a lot of Orwell's writing really is. But one of the key things that I think Orwell didn't foresee was essentially the democratization of authoritarianism. The way that Dorian and I talked about earlier, this kind of opt-in surveillance technology type thing that we have with social media, for example, and it, in a way, Orwell's nightmare sees this very centralized hub for authoritarian tendencies. There's one clear source of that. You can have one clear target as where that's coming from. I think what he didn't foresee is just how many potential sources of authoritarian tendencies you could see throughout the world when you have an abundance of democratic states, and that there would be such a degree of, I think, laxity in really confronting that. So we look at, for example, the readiness that people will have to share their data with tech giants, for example, the reticence of those tech companies to perhaps take enough responsibility for the ways in which their activities can have very political effects, and the tendency to maybe deny that that's political at all as well. But of course that does have political effects, that does make certain political outcomes more likely. So I think that's one of the key things that I think Orwell, I guess, hasn't prepared us for, and that maybe we need to really consider very seriously now, is how individuals' interactions influence each other, influence platforms, influence broader media discussions and debates that then feed back into what we think of as traditional politics, but from all of these directions. It makes it much harder really to kind of get a grip on.
Can I make a point there? I think Precious is quite right about that inability to foresee, and of course Orwell could only do what he could with the very limited technological resources he had at he had with him at the time. What I think he did foresee, which is a part, I think, possibly of what one might call the the corporatization of surveillance for surveillance technology. He did several times say that he thought that the future of totalitarianism was going to be managerial rather than military. And he said, in the film, I think I can't remember the exact quote, but he said, in 50 years' time, the man who runs the world or certain parts of the world is far more likely to be sitting in an office, than sitting in a military bunker. And so I think to that extent, he was very astute about the way in which the future state of the corporate world was turning. But those essays on James Burnham and the managerial revolution, I think, are very pressing there.
Thank you. And Geoff, just to kind of bring you in here, a question we can bring in from Zita. What's the impact of all of this on politicians and political parties, do you think?
Well, I think one of the problems is that all political parties try and claim Orwell's heritage, the critique of the left, his socialism at different times, even a debate over whether Orwell would have supported Brexit. So it's quite, but that makes him an interesting writer because he's able to escape, partisan allegiances, and his socialism was very English in a way. One thing we haven't mentioned, of course, was his patriotism, his view of Englishness, which some might find dated, very much shaped by the era in which he was living. But that was something that he felt strongly, and he thought that left-wing intellectuals who took their cookery from Paris and their opinions from Moscow, as he put it, were unable to do. They're unable to identify with patriotic, ordinary English people, to use that phrase. In a way, that I think does put him as a sort of eternal radical voice and a critic of political elites. And of course, those debates are now have been very significant, both in the run-up to 2016 and its aftermath. And I think Orwell is interesting because you can kind of position him in different places in that debate, and that's what makes him really interesting. The fact that he's claimed by many different political traditions doesn't make him in some way weak or incoherent. It actually adds to the importance of his writing, because if you want to interrogate and look for the truth and escape from partisan loyalties, then Orwell is a great guide in that respect.
And Geoff, what do you think, we're getting towards the end now, what do you think is the future of authoritarianism? Big question, I know, to cover.
Well, about 10 years ago, I was writing about Silvio Berlusconi, who was the only, at that time, populist leader in Western Europe. And everybody would ask me, how is it possible that a businessman who doesn't have a background in politics, could become Italy's prime minister? And of course, since then, we have Trump, and we have many other examples of that. So under what people often call populism, the populist trend that seems to have dominated politics so much. So I'm quite pessimistic, actually, about that, and turn to Orwell really for a way of understanding what's going on. That's what makes him so relevant, really.
What about you, Precious? Are you pessimistic or a bit more optimistic, or in between?
I think so. Authoritarianism in the present age is so different from the kind of authoritarianism that that Orwell was observing as he was writing, and the ways of kind of managing populations are very different under neo-authoritarian regimes as well. So, for all that social media, for example, might have its downsides and its potential issues in terms of data and surveillance, it nonetheless does kind of democratize voices in a way that's quite hard for neo-authoritarian regimes to manage. And so what we see is, with very few exceptions, neo-authoritarian regimes cannot manage those kind of data flows completely. So what they have to do is kind of work around them. And that involves, manipulating the kind of historical stories that get the most press, for example, in a kind of Orwellian fashion, and flooding the atmosphere with the stories that make more sense to them. But that's because there are alternatives happening. In a way, that gives me a slightly more optimistic view, because there is kind of capacity for alternatives to be articulated, but it's the extent to which people are willing and able to continue doing that in what might be a very weighted against them environment. So not wholly pessimistic, I would say, but it's just a case of those ways that we evolve to manage within a changing environment.
No, it's good to get different kind of points of view on that, and I know that we only have a minute or so to go. So, I know there's lots of questions we haven't got round to, but we will answer them on social media over the next week or so. But I want to finish off in a bit of a light way. I had a couple of kind of lighter questions kind of come in, and I'm going to pose the first one first of all to Dorian and David. And back to the novel, back to 1984. What's your favourite word or term from 1984 and why? If I can just jump in, I absolutely love the term doublethink. I think it's a great word, and I like reading about and hearing about the notion of progressive doublethink. And we can kind of contest that, but I just think it's a great word. How about you, Dorian?
I suppose it is. It's probably doublethink for me too, because I think it's the most profound observation about human nature and political psychology, and it's the most sort of timeless observation. And also it's one that hasn't been corrupted in the same way that thought police has been corrupted. All kinds of people who aren't the thought police get called the thought police. Big Brother has been, like almost everything else has been sort of like diluted and corrupted. And I think there's something about doublethink which is so sort of, it's so complex, but also so true and so lasting, that it just, to me, sort of remains evergreen. And I'm sure there's some other ones that never got picked up, but I can't remember what they were. There's some kind of like, it's like the hidden gems, the buried gems in 1984 that never caught on, but they escape me at the moment.
How about you, David?
Well, actually, I admit that the resonance of all those phrases that we remember is, still sort of chimes up. But in fact, my favourite phrase in the entire book is when Winston and Julia are sitting there in their love nest above Mr. Charrington's shop, and Julia suddenly goes, "Rats in this room," because Orwell had this great rat phobia, or not so much a phobia as an obsession that went on for about 35 years of his life, and the idea that that all this kind of psychological baggage should suddenly be unpacked in that scene where Julia sees the rat hurrying off behind the wainscot, and then of course you get the rat. It's extraordinary how this thread runs all the way through his life and then kind of explodes, to mix a metaphor, right at the end of 1984. So in some ways that's more vivid to me, I suppose, than the phrases that have entered the language over the last 70 years.
And just to kind of finish off for Geoff and Precious, another question which has come in from Vanessa. If you could chuck any politician, political regime, political moment, media moment, etc., into Orwell's memory hole, never to be seen again, what or who would you pick? And let's start with Geoff first, putting Geoff on the spot.
Well, I would have said Silvio Berlusconi a few years ago. Well, we're all talking Trump at the moment, but I think it's going to be difficult to do that. Incidentally, you didn't ask me about my favourite word. I would say newspeak, partly because after being at Open University for how many decades, I'm still find the jargon here completely impenetrable.
How about you, Precious? You can answer either question. Favourite word or memory hole?
I'm going to go for favourite word, and for me it's doublethink as well, but particularly because I'm really interested in conspiracy theories and what makes people interested in them. And one of the things that happens a lot of the time is people can espouse various conspiracy theories that completely conflict with one another, but nonetheless with this idea that, there's a corrupt elite that's seeking its own interests at the expense of the people's. And I think that's conspiratorial beliefs are often a very good example of doublethink in the present age.
Thank you very much. We are now out of time. I think it's been a great event with some really interesting discussions between the speakers and some fantastic questions sent in from the audience. Please do chat amongst yourselves still on Twitter using OU1984 as the hashtag. As I said before, we'll look at any questions we didn't get round to and we will answer them on Twitter, or at least do something with them so they're not left hanging. I'm pleased to say that this event will not be chucked down the memory hole. We have been recording and we'll make that available as soon as possible. And for anyone who lost those kind of 5 minutes in the middle, it was recorded and we'll make it available online so that it hasn't been lost. So thank you for coming to the audience, and thank you to Dorian and David in particular for speaking about their work, and Precious and Geoff for bringing their own perspectives too. And thank you very much and have a nice evening.